All right, hope everybody's doing okay. Figured I'd do a little bit different setting than what I usually do. We're going to talk about crankbait rod setups. Like I've said before, I'm not a professional. I've been fishing for over 30 plus years, bass fishing, and I spent a little time with a crankbait. Honestly, I spent probably more time the first several years focusing more on spinnerbait and the jig than I did anything, just because of the convenience. You know, I mean, that's just when I was kind of growing up. That's just what people did. I mean, you had some crankbaits, but you didn't really spend a whole lot of time with crankbaits because crankbaits were expensive. They were hard to come by. And I mean, nowadays it still is too, but we came up with things over the years that made it a little bit easier to retrieve them, and crankbaits actually have better actions now, and you get a little more out of them. With social media especially, you got a lot more people talking about them, telling you about how to use them. When I was a kid, really your most famous crankbait that I remember, and I was just blessed to be just a regular kid, was the old Rapala minnow. You threw it out, you twitched it a couple times, and you reeled it in. That was pretty much my extent of learning about what crankbaits were. So over the years, I've developed a little bit of understanding. Believe it or not, as I've gotten older, I've gone more towards the crankbait. We'll explain that just a little bit. So I used to just fish pretty much like I was saying. If it was windy, I fished a spinnerbait. If it was calm and slick, then I usually pitched a jig, or I threw a jig out. I used to use worms a lot until I figured out the jig. Blessed by an older man that taught me how to use jigs, so I started using jigs. So I started using my jig, but when I used my jig, I was pretty successful with it. But what I learned right off the bat is that bass aren't always eating. Okay, bass aren't always in that active eating mode. You look at yourself. How many times a day are you really in a eating mode? Okay, and you're a human being and you eat probably 3 times a day. Bass don't always do that. Bass tend to eat more towards seasons. They eat based on temperature outside. Their eating habits change a lot, and that's a whole big other thing to get into that honestly I'm probably not the right guy to talk about that, because I'm not a very scientific guy. I'm very thankful though to be able to have learned a little bit that I've learned. But I have, like I said, I've spent a little more time fishing crankbaits this last year than I probably have in quite a few years of just my life just fishing. And the reason for that is like I've said before, the way that I fish my jigs is a little bit different. When I throw my jig out, yes, I do kind of slow down and do a lot of a drag, but I also do a lot of a hop, a lot of shake, a lot of movement. So believe it or not, I learned years ago. I was at this lake, local lake. It was a grass lake, and average depth maybe 12 feet. A lot of grass in it. Some areas 25, whatever, but you know what I mean. But anyway, everybody would go out there and fish these little bitty 16th, 8th ounce weights on plastics, and I would fish a 3/8 jig. And most of the guys that I would go with, they were like, how in the world are you getting bites on that 3/8 jig? How do you keep it out of the grass? Well, later on down the years, people started talking about swimming a jig, and believe it or not, that's not what I was doing. I wasn't swimming a jig. So what I was doing was I was actually working my jig like a jerkbait. I would throw it out and I would hop it to me, and when I would feel it hit the bottom, I would pop it back up. So I was constantly moving it towards me, and what that was doing was that was giving a reaction strike. Well, that's, as I've gotten older, that's hard on a man's shoulders. So what I tended to do here this last year, and I learned it a lot while I was fishing out of a kayak, is whenever it would get windy, then I would tend to throw a crankbait. Well, I learned even on days that it wasn't windy, I happened to be reeling the bait along one day and it hit a stump, and when it hit the stump it went left, and next thing you know I caught 4 or 5 fish and they were all 2 or 3 pounds or better. And I realized right then something that I had forgotten from years ago, is that reaction bite is more of a triggering bite, believe it or not, than a hunger bite. Hunger bite, being a bass, is just hungry and wants to eat. Our lakes are so overpressured. There's so much going on with people on the lakes anymore. So many people on them, whether it be recreation, whether it be other fishermen, whether it be kayakers, whether it be what it is. Our lakes are so overfished that, believe it or not, I believe, yes, there's days you can slow down with a jig, but you really need to, if you want to be successful bass fishing, you really need to learn how to fish a crankbait. There's no, and I hate to say the same cliche that everybody uses, but it's the truth. There's one man in professional bass fishing that he's pretty much won more classic titles, and there's actually 2 of them, than anybody else. And if you look at both of those guys, both of them fish crankbaits almost exclusively. Okay, one of them, of course, been Kevin Van Dam, and the other one, Rick Clunn. Both those guys pretty much fish crankbaits exclusively. They may fish a little bit of topwaters, and they may fish jerk baits and different things, but they're pretty much treble hook reaction bait guys. They'll tell you that's what gets the most bites. And I've learned that that's pretty much what it is. So not only that, but it's easier on my shoulders. That's what started me on it. So it's not that I'm just a huge expert. I'm just telling you, that's what I started realizing. What's hard is to get crankbait bites in clear water. You have to do one or two things. You either have to go deep, or you have to crank faster. A lot of people don't think about that. They throw out their crankbait and they get stuck in pretty much the same routine. They throw the crankbait out, they bounce it back. They throw the crankbait out, they bounce it back, and they're like, I didn't get any bites. I'm gonna pick up this worm. They throw it out. Oh, look, I caught this fish. Go down the bank. But the problem is you don't cover water. Okay, you sit there and you throw your worm, and you may catch 4 or 5 fish, but you never really cover water. In my mind, I'm thinking, okay, I've caught 2 or 3 fish here on a crankbait. I'm gonna put this crankbait down, I'm gonna pick up a jig, I'm gonna throw back in that place and see if I can get a couple more bites. Now, I may throw a crankbait 4 or 5 times to one log or one little tree stump or something, but I'm first covering water because I'm trying to find them. A lot of people depend on their electronics to do that. That's fine if you want to do that, but the truth is, to me, that electronic, all it tells me is fish is there. It doesn't tell me if they're biting or not. When I throw that crankbait in there and I bring it back and I think, man, there ought to be something in there, and I throw it back, bring it through again through different angles, and I hit that stump or I hit that rock and I can feel it bouncing around and I have one smash it, then I got a pretty idea that they reacted to it. Then I might throw that jig in there and say, hey, I wonder if there's another one in there. And you'd be surprised how many times I've caught 4 or 5 fish. There's actually one time that I came up and I threw crankbaits in this one area. Well, I knew fish must stay in this area. I came back and I started throwing something like a jig in there, and I caught 15, 20 fish off a little bush that wasn't maybe 3 foot by 3 foot. Why? Because all those fish were associating to that, but I would have never found it if I'd have been 20 yards down the road working a little worm slowly down through there. So the reason I throw a crankbait is because, to me, it's a tool. It's a searching tool. If the water's real clear, be honest with you, a lot of times what I tend to do is throw a topwater. Okay, just because they get less of a view of it. It's real hard to reel a crankbait. You can only reel it so fast, or me personally anyway. But what I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of why I use the crankbaits first, and talk a little bit about it. There's different depths that you can use, of course, but I've gotten away a little bit from the 10-pound line, 12-pound line, throwing out deep and all this, just because, to be honest with you, I tend to fish around a lot of rock, and I tend to fish around, I'm it's not a bragging, it's just how it is. I tend to be around a lot of 3 to 4 pound fish, okay? 3 to 4 pound fish, when you get to that 10, 12 pound line, it's possible, but after you've been rubbing on that rock, that 10 pound line becomes 6 pound line. That 12 pound line become 8 pound line. Is it possible to do? Sure. But I spend a lot of time grinding those crankbaits, purposely throwing those crankbaits up under trees, into places. I've been blessed so far to only have lost very few of them. Of course, I've got that long pole that you see me use sometimes. But I've used a lot of different crankbaits, a lot of different setups. And here recently, I'll talk a little bit about the crankbait that I've been using here recently. This is it's very similar to the Lucky Craft little 1.5. This is a custom one by S&M Laurel River Customs. They're the ones that have been painting them for me. Young man there, his name is Shane. He's been the one that's been painting them for me. I really appreciate it. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the crankbait, but I do want to mention that, you know, the type of crankbait that you use makes a big difference, especially in the type of fishing that I'm doing. If you're going around a lot of shallow, it's hard to beat that square bill to go around shallow cover. It deflects off that cover very well. Everybody knows that watches this channel pretty much knows I use the rock crawler a lot. Well, here recently I realized that not only do they have this little 1.5, but they make a 1.5 that's not a square bear, it has a longer lip. That also has a similar action to this, but it gives me a longer lip to get down a little deeper, and that's what I was using in my last video, and I like it as well. Why? Because same thing again, we're looking for a reaction bite. A lot of times we're not looking for, are they hungry? And we do get into that sometimes, but I've kind of started gearing the setup that I use anymore around that reaction bite strategy, just because it seems to produce for me a lot better. A lot of guys are going to get into more of the finesse type of crankbaiting, and I do that some in the wintertime. But right now, we're in the month of October, and to me, this is prime time to be throwing a crankbait. Yes, I can throw a jig, and you see me throwing a jig a lot, but right now is prime time to be throwing a crankbait, because you're going to, the temperature is starting to go down, those fish are starting to feed. They're coming up because they know that the cold water is here. They're getting a little break just like us. We're able to move around outside a little bit more. I love this time of year because I can go out and mow yard and do different things. I'm not sweating, I'm not having to breathe real heavy. Those fish are the same way, especially those smallmouth right now. Their bodies, because of this colder temperatures are starting to come down, they're able to move more. You can see I put a couple videos up of bait fish in the back of these pockets. Those fish know where those bait fish are. They're going to start ganging up on them pretty soon. You can throw a jig in there if you want to, and you can throw a swim bait in there and different things, but personally, I'm going to throw that crankbait in there. I've got some that are more shad pattern. This one here has got more of a purple top and chartreuse belly, more of a bluegill imitator, but this right here will attract a bite, because what it's doing is it's bouncing around, and all those rocks and all those trees, and fish come out and snatch it. Okay, so what I tend to do, and like I said, I've used all kinds of lines. This will explain a little bit why I choose the equipment that I do. I've been throwing these crankbaits anymore in 15-pound cigar. This is Red Label cigar, okay? The reason I've started to do that, I'm going to go back to that rock and those trees. I was using a 12-pound cigar. It's called Basics. It's a brand new line they've come out with. They run about $10 a spool. I got away from it. I got away from it because the last time I went out, I started breaking off even up into my reel and everywhere else. And a lot of it had to do because I fished around a lot of those rocks. This line here, now if I went to a Braze X or something like that, it'd be better, but it's a little out of my price range, to be honest with you. I like to have, there comes a time, in my opinion, to where you either have gas to go or you buy pretty things. So to me, I'll settle for this and retie once or twice, and I'll go ahead and have gas to go fishing. But going back to this setup, so 15 pounds is what I've settled. And you're going to say, well, a lot of people are going to say this, well, 10-pound test is better because it gets your bait deeper. I hear so much about your bait deeper, it's unreal. And I've tried it. Very true. It will go deeper. But I'm going to ask you a question. How many times am I really trying to get my crankbait 1 foot or 2 foot deeper than what it actually was? Very few. Very few times, okay? Most times, if I want a crankbait to get deeper, I'm going to get a deeper lip. When those guys start throwing those 6XDs and all that, listen to the guys talk about it. Most of the time, they're throwing it on 15-pound fluorocarbon, and they're getting the bait deep just enough. Why? Because they just went to a bait that had a deeper lip. A lot of times, I think we wear ourselves out, and I've done this by experience. I'm throwing a little shallow crankbait. This thing's probably going about 4 or 5 feet on this 15-pound line, depending on my cast. Most of the times, I'm up close enough to the bank to where it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to get down that deep. I don't need it to get down that deep. If I really want to get a bait deep, a lot of times, what I'm going to do is I'm going to back away from the point. I'm going to back away from where I'm at. I'm going to make a longer cast. Therefore, my bait is going to get a little bit deeper. And I'll be honest with you, if I want my bait to get too much deeper, then I'm just going to drag a jig. Because once again, like I said, personally, I'm trying to cover water, and I'm trying to bounce this and ricochet this around different things. To me, after you get past that 15 to 20 foot mark with a crankbait, yes, it's great, but it's not my style of fishing. I've tried it. I can't cover as much water doing it. Later on, I may give it another try later on next summer. But for right now, this is what has had me decently successful, so this is what I've been learning. 15 pound, what's the purpose of the heavier line? The heavier line is I want those fish, I want to be able to get those fish out. I want to control the fish, okay? A lot of times, a lot of people tend to use a crankbait rod and line, and then the whole time they're stressed out and worried about the line breaking. I'll tell you right now, you start throwing a crankbait around 3 to 4 pound bass, regular largemouth, you've got your hands full when that bass is hot and you've just caught him on that treble hook or accidentally snagged him in the head or in the side of the face. You got a fight on your hands, okay? But I'm going to step it up to you about 20 times. You hook a smallmouth that's about 3 or 4 pounds on a crankbait around rock or around bushes, and son, you have got a hold of a whole other type of fish. If you don't have the right line and the right setup, you're going to be heartbroken because he's going to take you and eat your lunch, okay? That's another reason why I settle for that 15-pound line, okay? And if I need to, I'll just throw long. I'll just throw a little bit further, or I'll switch and I'll use a jig. Now, I've had G. Loomis crankbait setups. I've had arc setups. I've had other Shimano cranking rods. I've had Bass Pro cranking sticks. I've had everything I've had all kinds of different setups. They all work from time to time. What I've settled on here lately, and I came up on it as a blessing, was this SLX crankbait rod. Now, this one here that I use, it's an SLX C70MG. Okay, it's medium glass is what it calls it. It's got a modded action. It's not a real heavy rod. It says that it's a glass rod. It feels kind of like a glass composite is what it feels like, but it's an extremely sensitive rod for just going down the lake and fishing. I used to have an arc rod. It's called the Grinder. Love that rod for throwing crankbaits. The problem with that rod was I accidentally closed my rod locker on it and busted it, and then I realized actually how thin the walls was. when I went to go take it back to get another one, the warranty on it, I had to pay $70. And I had gotten that rod for $110. I think, yeah, it was $110. I'd bought that rod at Tackle Warehouse on sale. So in order for me to get another one, I had to pay another $70 back to the manufacturer because it broke it just by setting that rod locker on it. Now, don't get me wrong, that's still better. So, I mean, you think, well, you paid $30 or $40 less than a regular one, that's a good deal. That is a good deal, but I told myself, well, if I'm going to do that, then honestly, I'll just go ahead and buy me another rod. So what I did was I kept looking around, and I kept shopping, and then I wound up getting me an E6X rod that was used. I used it for a while. I loved that rod, but had the opportunity to trade that rod. A lot of us, that's what we do. We keep on trying to find the better thing. So I traded that rod off because I eventually wanted to have 2 crankbait rods. So I sold the arc grinder, the other one that I had, and I traded off the E6X that I had. And then I ran up on a deal to where I wound up trading a crucial rod that I had, and I wound up getting 2 of these SLX rods. So, and another friend of mine, I helped him find them. They had them on sale for $100. You could buy one and get one free. So for $50 a piece, wound up getting these E6 SLX rods, cranking rods. So that's basically my setup. I use a 6.3 reel. This is the SLX XT. It's got that better gearing system in it. It's the 150. Holds plenty of line for me. I use that, like I said, I use that 15-pound Seagar. For 2 reels, I can usually take 1 spool of 200 yards, and I can put 100 yards on each one of them with that diameter, which is perfect for me because that saves me a little bit of money. That way I can go buy 1 spool and keep it in my box. And if I ever have a backlash, which does happen to me, then I know I can re-spool my line right back up, and it's not going to cost me a whole lot of money. So here's the question that everybody usually asks other than that. And I know this video is kind of long, but I wanted to just spend some time to maybe help somebody who didn't know a whole lot. Why do I use a 7-foot rod instead of a big 7.5 or 7.11? Number one is my rod locker. My rod locker, 7-foot rod's about the most I can get in it. Now I've got a rod that I use for my jigs, it's a 7.5, but that's a whole different story. I'll make a video about it later on one day. 7 foot to me, if you've seen on some of the videos that I make, I can pitch and roll cast underneath those trees. I can skip baits underneath it. My daughter was with me one day and she's like, Dad, how in the world do you take it crankbaits and different baits and skip them underneath those trees like you do without getting hung up so much? And I was like, well, I get hung up a lot. And she's like, well, I was being nice, but still, how do you skip it? And I'm like, well, it's just years and years. It's practice, years and years of doing the same thing over and over. So 7 foot to me, I'm 6 foot tall, so 7 foot's a pretty standard size rod, okay? 6'6" would be great, but I've learned that 6'6" doesn't have the same leverage when you're fighting a fish. Why do I choose a medium action? Medium action I choose, and we'll see if I can do this. I've done this before on another little video. I choose a medium action because this rod has quite a bit, you can see that, bend. Now it bends a little more. It's kind of hard to do on this screen, but it has a bend all the way back through there. So it'll little by little bend, even back through here. You can see it bends. So about 50% of the rod has a bend to it, but honestly, it has not quite a medium heavy strength, but it's kind of hard to explain. But it does. The SLX or the E6X rod that I had, the G Loomis, it was a whole lot more parabolic, and I liked it. The only problem was on some of those bigger fish, I wasn't controlling them. They were controlling me. Whenever I hooked them, yes, they stayed pinned good, but I couldn't control those fish. Another thing I noticed is when I threw baits with a size 4 hook. Couldn't get those fish in a lot. I could get them in, but a lot of times they would come off in the boat, or because that hook wasn't penetrating all the way. So I needed something that had between the two. It had enough backbone to drive a hook that was size 4, and at the same time I needed something that could still, I could use those little those other little hooks, those number 6s and number 5s that usually come on those rock crawlers, or if I ever needed it as a backup jerkbait rod or something that way, because some of the crankbaits come with number 6 hooks. So that's the reason why I chose that setup. So honestly, for about $60 a rod, I couldn't beat it, okay? And that way I had 2 of them. I could go down the bank. I usually have a shallow one, and I usually have one with a longer lip. Why do I do that? I do that so that when I go down the bank, as the contour changes, I don't really have to stop. I just have to set down the rod with a longer bill and pick up the other one. That way, remember, I'm using my crankbait a lot to cover water. I'm trying to figure out where they're at. If I think, you know what, I'm gonna go to the back of creeks, then I go to the back of the creek and I pick up my shallow one and I bounce it around. As I work my way out of that creek, wherever I'm at, then I'll switch to the different ones. Now I may still, up there shallow, I may still throw this little shallow diver, a little square bill. I may throw it up way up in there and bounce it around. Question a lot of people are gonna have: why in the world do I need a crankbait rod? Truth is, you can throw these crankbaits on any type of rod you got, okay? If you want to throw them on a heavy action rod, you can go for it and throw them. They've got number 4 trebles, okay? So you're probably not going to bend it out. You can throw it on 20-pound line if you want to. But here's the thing. Number 1, landing the fish is going to be a whole different story. Here's the reason why. And the action of your bait's going to be different. When you throw a crankbait out and you start reeling it and it bounces, that rod restricts what that bait's able to do. If you've got a very stiff rod, then that bait is only going to be able to bounce so much and have so much action. It's just like the line that you put on it. If you put 20-pound line on a crankbait, you're restricting what that bait can do. That bait's not going to be able to move as much. Why is that? Because it's no different than me and you. If you put a heavy log chain around my neck, I'm not going to be able to walk around very much. It's going to weigh me down. Now, if I put a little gold chain on my neck, then I hardly know it's there, and I'm going to be able to have more action. It's the same thing with these little crankbaits, okay? It all depends on what you're wanting to do. When that thing comes around those logs and it bounces around, that crankbait, that tip, it needs to have that tip to allow it to move around. Same thing happens when you're reeling. When you're sitting there and you're reeling your crankbait and it's bouncing around, if you're just constantly just grinding it, then you're just pushing it, and that thing is just digging the whole time. If you kind of reel it, and when you feel it hit stop just for a second, that crankbait's going to come down and it's going to bounce and it's going to stop, hang there for a minute, and then it's going to go. And it's going to hang, it's going to go for a minute. That crankbait rod's what allows you to do that. Another thing is that explain to me why people use crankbait rods so much. Is fish don't eat always like we think they do. Me and you go up, we're going to reach with our hand, we're going to grab, and we're going to yank this. It's not what a fish does. What a fish does is he comes up behind it, he opens up his mouth, and he sucks the water and everything around it, so he back pressures every bit of that, kind of like when you flush the toilet. He opens it up, and that back pressure, not only is he moving forward, but he does both in one motion. In one motion, he comes up, and when he inhales it, he closes his mouth, and when he closes his mouth, then he turns. Okay? He can do this super fast. He can inhale it just as quick as he can exhale it. So if in any moment he thinks, oh my goodness, I don't need that, and you say, well, I get a lot of fish smacked on the side of the face. How can that be? Because believe it or not, they're not always feeding, okay? Most of the time, what bass are doing is they're coming up and they're trying to kill it. So they're coming up from the side and they're smacking it, whether it be with their head, their tail, whatever. They just want that bait out of their way. They're coming up to stun it first, and then they'll come back and eat it. I've had several fish do that, come up and nip. I learned that years ago throwing a spinnerbait at nighttime. you'd be throwing that spinnerbait, dragging it, and all of a sudden this bass come up, and you'd feel them pop, pop, and then all of a sudden your rod felt like somebody's ripping it out of your hand. A smallmouth, real bad about it. What were they doing? First, they was trying to kill it. They realized they couldn't kill it. Then they're just going, you know what, I'm just going to eat you. That's what they do a lot of times. They come up and they hit a bait and hit a bait, and then all of a sudden they just smack it. And when they smack it, then you know what, I'm going to kill you. So they just take it over. That rod, that bend in that rod right there, allows that fish to take that bait. When they do that motion of drawing it in, it allows them to take that in their mouth. Okay? Now, the problem is, you say, well, then I just want one that's just like a whip. The problem is not only do you need them to get that bait into their mouth, but you also need to get those treble hooks to be able to stay in their mouth. If you're pulling too much on them, it's not like when you set the hook with a jig. You set the hook with a jig, it comes all the way through. Most of the time with the crankbait, you just barely got them stuck, either outside or on the inside, just barely stuck. You need pressure on it, but you don't need to drag it to where it cuts and rips out of their face. So you have to do both. You have to have your drag sit right, and you have to have that bend in that rod. So that's just a little brief overview of, I know it's been a long video, but that's just a little brief overview of my crankbait setup, why I use the crankbait setup that I do, how I use it, just a little bit overview to anything. Anything that you want to chat about, that you want to talk about, maybe you all have different opinions of why you use the setups that you do, you're more welcome to put comments at the bottom. Like I said, I'm not an expert. I'm just telling you this is the reasons why I use what I do. This is why I've my system has basically evolved around what I'm doing right now. Just because it seems to be what works for me. I've had a little bit of success so far throwing it this way and using it this way, so it's blessed me over the years. I've really enjoyed it. To be honest with you, another little crankbait setup that a lot of people don't think about. Can you use a medium action rod? Well, sure, you can use a medium action rod. The only thing I ran into with a medium action rod is it has too much bend to it. A medium heavy to me has too much power behind it, depending on what bait you're using. But I used a little square bill for years on a medium heavy rod and lost fish here and there. Does that mean that I'm not going to lose fish on this? Anybody's watched my videos long enough know and see that you lose fish on this too. So there's no 100% guarantee of any system that you use. But this system is more comfortable, it's lighter on my shoulders, and I'm able to get the majority of the fish in that I'm catching. Hopefully pretty soon. I wasn't able to go here lately, go fishing, because I've kind of been sick here lately, but starting to feel a little bit better. Hopefully next week I'll get to go for a little bit. Like I said, the temperature right now is just perfect. Can't wait to go out and throw these little fellas around and catch a few more fish. I know this video is a little bit long, but I hope it helps you a little bit. Anyway, go out, throw you a few crankbaits. Hope Lord God blesses you. More than anything, just have fun. Go out there and have a good time. It's most of us, we probably go out there a little too hard on ourselves, and we try probably a little bit too hard. Just go out and just enjoy the day, enjoy the creation, and be glad you're not working. Be glad you're outside enjoying the wonderful scenery and everything around us. And hope God blesses you with your fish or two while you're out there. Anybody has any comments or anything, just post them below. Thank y'all very much for all the support you've been giving me. Thank you for sharing my videos, and thank you for you're all a blessing to me. Y'all have a good day. God bless.